My name is Eleanor, and at 67 years old, I never imagined my life would come to this. After Richard died, I built a comfortable life in our Kentucky home. When Thomas moved back after his divorce, I was happy to have my son close again. How quickly joy turned to terror. The day he threw boiling water on me, screaming, "Die somewhere else." I knew I had reached my breaking point. No mother should endure such betrayal. Before I share my story, let me know where you all are watching from. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe family should be about love, not abuse. Now let me take you back to where it all began. I was born in 1957 in a small town outside Lexington, Kentucky. My childhood was simple but happy, with parents who worked hard to provide for me and my two younger sisters. Daddy worked at the local factory, and Mama kept house and tended our vegetable garden. We never had much money, but we had values, love, and respect for one another. When I was 17, I met Richard at a church social. He was 21, handsome as could be, with kind eyes and a gentle manner that made me feel safe. We courted for 2 years before marrying in 1976, just after my 19th birthday. Richard worked construction while I took night classes to become a nurse. Those early years were lean but sweet. We rented a tiny apartment and saved every penny toward our dream of owning a home. In 1982, we welcomed our son, Thomas. The moment I held him, I felt a love so powerful it nearly knocked the breath from me. Richard cried when he first held him, promising to be the kind of father his own had never been. Thomas was our miracle. Our only child after 3 miscarriages had broken our hearts. Perhaps that was part of the problem. We loved him so fiercely, wanted to give him everything, that we sometimes failed to teach him the value of hard work and sacrifice. Thomas was a bright child, quick to learn but equally quick to frustration when things did not come easily. Richard was patient with him, spending hours teaching him to throw a baseball or fix a bicycle chain. I still remember how Richard would say, "Take your time, Tommy. Nothing worth doing comes easy." As Thomas grew into his teenage years, I noticed a stubborn streak developing. He expected good grades without studying, resented chores, and developed a sharp tongue when challenged. Richard and I would discuss our concerns at night, wondering if we had spoiled him or if this was just normal teenage rebellion. When Thomas was 16, our lives changed forever. Richard suffered a massive heart attack while at work. By the time they got him to the hospital, it was too late. At 45, my husband was gone, leaving me a widow with a teenage son to raise alone. Grief hit Thomas hard. He went from being a mouthy but essentially good kid to withdrawn and angry. He blamed the doctors, the ambulance for being slow, and even God. I was too consumed with my own grief and the sudden burden of being the sole provider to give him the support he needed. Looking back, I wonder if that period planted the seeds for what would come decades later. I threw myself into my nursing career, working extra shifts to ensure Thomas could go to college. He graduated high school with decent grades and enrolled at the University of Kentucky. During those years, I saw glimpses of the sweet boy he had once been, especially when he met Stephanie during his junior year. Stephanie was studying education, a kind and sensible girl from a good family in Louisville. She seemed to bring out the best in Thomas. After graduation, they married and moved to Cincinnati for Thomas's first corporate job. I was so proud seeing him in his suits, carrying a briefcase and talking about business deals. By his 30th birthday, they had given me 2 beautiful grandchildren, Emma and Jason. For about a decade, Thomas thrived in the corporate world. Each Christmas and birthday, the gifts he sent grew more expensive. He would call to tell me about promotions, raises, and the bigger house they had purchased. But I also noticed concerning changes in his personality. The humble boy I raised was being replaced by someone who boasted about his salary and looked down on those he considered beneath him. In 2015, the company Thomas worked for went through a major restructuring. At 41, my son found himself unemployed for the first time in his adult life. His identity had become so entwined with his career that this loss devastated him. Around the same time, his marriage to Stephanie began falling apart. She later told me he had become controlling, critical, and emotionally distant. The divorce was ugly. Thomas fought for the house and custody of the children, but the court awarded Stephanie primary custody, with Thomas having the children every other weekend. He was ordered to pay alimony and child support that, combined with his unemployment, quickly drained his savings. One Tuesday evening in late autumn, my phone rang. It was Thomas, his voice subdued in a way I hadn't heard since his father died. "Mom," he said, "I need to ask a favor. Things are tight right now, and I was wondering if I could stay with you for a while. Just until I get back on my feet." My heart ached for my struggling son. Without hesitation, I said yes. The house had been lonely since Richard passed, and I thought having Thomas home might be good for both of us. I cleared out the spare bedroom, bought fresh groceries, and waited eagerly for his arrival. When he pulled into my driveway with a U-Haul full of expensive furniture and boxes of designer clothes, I should have recognized it as the first warning sign. This wasn't a son coming home temporarily. This was a man planning to stay. The day Thomas moved in was filled with a mixture of emotions. I felt a mother's joy at having my child home again, but also a strange uneasiness I couldn't quite name. At 63, I had been living alone for nearly 20 years and had settled into comfortable routines. I had plans for my retirement years, including traveling to see the Grand Canyon and volunteering at the local hospital. Thomas arrived with far more possessions than I expected. He seemed surprised by the size of the guest bedroom. "This is kind of small, Mom," he said, looking around with a frown. "Where am I supposed to put all my things?" I suggested he could use some of the basement for storage, and he nodded without enthusiasm. That first night I made his favorite meal, pot roast with potatoes and carrots, just like I used to make when he was a boy. He took 2 bites and pushed it away. "I avoid red meat now," he said, "and these carrots are overcooked." I apologized and offered to make something else, but he waved me off and ordered takeout. It was a small moment, but it stung. Richard had always appreciated my cooking, never failing to thank me for each meal. In those first few weeks, Thomas spent most days on his laptop, telling me he was submitting job applications and networking with former colleagues. He would emerge from his room around noon, make coffee, and settle on the couch until evening. I tried to give him space, understanding that losing both his job and marriage had wounded his pride. By the second month, subtle changes began appearing in our living arrangement. The television in the living room was now perpetually tuned to channels Thomas preferred. My knitting basket was moved from its spot by the recliner to make room for his gaming equipment. My morning routine of listening to the local news over coffee was interrupted by his complaints about the noise disturbing his sleep. "Mom, could you be a little more considerate? Some of us are trying to rest," he said one morning when I was quietly washing dishes at 8 a.m. My friend Mabel from church noticed the changes in me when we met for our weekly lunch. "You seem tired, Eleanor," she said, concern etching her kind face. "Is everything all right with Thomas living there?" "Oh, it's just an adjustment," I said, making excuses. "He's going through a rough patch." "Just make sure you're taking care of yourself too," Mabel cautioned. "Sometimes our children can take advantage without even realizing it." I dismissed her concerns, but deep down they resonated. Thomas had begun asking for loans to cover his car payment and credit card bills. What started as $100 here and there quickly escalated to thousands. My retirement savings, meant to sustain me through my golden years, were beginning to dwindle. 3 months into our arrangement, Thomas came into the kitchen one evening as I was preparing dinner. "Mom, I've been thinking," he said, leaning against the counter. "The master bedroom would make more sense for me. It has its own bathroom, and I need the space for my work setup." I stood frozen, spatula in hand. The master bedroom had been mine and Richard's. After his death, it remained a space of comfort and memories. "But Thomas, all my things are there. My clothes, You can move your stuff to the guest room," he interrupted. "It makes more sense for the person working to have the larger space. You're just here by yourself most of the day." Before I could properly object, he continued, "I'll help you move everything this weekend. It will be better this way." Somehow, I found myself nodding in agreement, a knot forming in my stomach. That weekend, Thomas moved my belongings to the smaller room with an efficiency that suggested he'd been planning this for some time. As I watched him carry Richard's old dresser to the basement, declaring it outdated, tears stung my eyes. My son's drinking habit, which had been occasional when he first arrived, became a nightly ritual. He would start with beer around 4 in the afternoon, progressing to bourbon as the evening wore on. With alcohol came heightened criticism. "This house is so outdated, Mom. When was the last time you had anything renovated?" he would ask, gesturing with his glass. "The kitchen looks like it's straight out of the 1990s. I would remind him gently that keeping up the house on a nurse's pension had its limitations. This would trigger lectures about how I should have invested better or saved more, as though my decades of hard work meant nothing. The rare occasions when Emma and Jason visited were increasingly tense. Thomas would snap at them for being too loud or making a mess. I noticed how Emma, once so talkative with me, had become quiet and watchful. Jason flinched whenever his father raised his voice. After they left, I tried to discuss my concerns with Thomas. "Don't tell me how to parent my kids," he snarled. "Maybe if you and Dad had been stricter with me, I wouldn't be in this situation now." 6 months into our arrangement, Thomas announced he was taking a break from job hunting. "The market is terrible right now," he explained, pouring himself a midday drink. "No point wasting energy on applications that go nowhere." Instead of looking for work, he spent hours playing video games, the sounds of gunfire and explosions echoing through the house. When I suggested he might consider jobs outside his field just to generate some income, he exploded. "You don't get it. I was a senior manager. I can't just go flip burgers somewhere. Do you want people looking down on me? On you." I retreated, apologizing for upsetting him. More and more, I found myself walking on eggshells in my own home, carefully measuring my words to avoid triggering his anger. My friends called less frequently as Thomas would answer my phone, telling them I was busy or napping, even when I wasn't. One evening, I returned from grocery shopping to find 3 strangers in my living room, drinking my good whiskey and smoking inside the house. Thomas had never asked if he could have guests over, much less people I didn't know. "Thomas, could I speak with you in the kitchen?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. In the kitchen, he dismissed my concerns before I could fully express them. "They're potential business contacts," he said, though I noted none of them were dressed for business. "Stop embarrassing me in front of my guests." I retreated to my room, locking the door as the raucous laughter grew louder. That night, I cried into my pillow for the first time since Richard's funeral. The son I had raised, the boy who once made me Mother's Day cards and picked wildflowers for the kitchen table, seemed to have vanished. In his place was a stranger who looked at me with barely concealed contempt. Yet each time I considered asking him to leave, my heart would soften. He was still my son. He was struggling. What kind of mother would turn her back on her child? So I stayed silent, hoping this phase would pass, that my real son would return to me. I didn't realize then that my silence was enabling a situation that would only grow worse. The warning signs were flashing red, but I was colorblind with maternal love. As months stretched into a year, Thomas's true intentions became clear. He wasn't staying temporarily until he found work. He had stopped looking entirely. My home had become his permanent residence, and I was gradually being relegated to the role of unpaid housekeeper, cook, and bank account. "I don't think we need to keep paying for the lawn service," he announced one day. "It's a waste of money." I tried to explain that at my age, maintaining the half-acre yard was beyond my physical capabilities, especially in Kentucky's humid summers. "Then I'll take care of it," he promised. 2 weeks later, a notice from the Homeowners Association arrived, warning about the unmaintained lawn. When I mentioned it to Thomas, he exploded. "Stop nagging me. I said I'll do it when I have time." The lawn service was never reinstated, and eventually, my elderly neighbor's son began mowing our front yard out of pity, refusing payment when I offered. Thomas's physical changes to the house continued without my input or permission. He painted the living room a dark gray I disliked, claiming the previous soft yellow was depressing. He replaced Richard's recliner, which I had preserved all these years, with a gaming chair. When I returned from a doctor's appointment one afternoon, I discovered he had removed all the family photos from the hallway wall to hang a large television. "But Thomas, those pictures were important to me," I said, finding the photos stacked carelessly in a box in the garage. "The house needed updating, Mom. Those old pictures made the place look like a museum." Among the discarded photos was my favorite wedding picture, and the last family photo taken before Richard's death. The glass on that frame was cracked. When I held it up questioningly, Thomas shrugged. Things break when you move them, he said without apology. My health began to suffer under the constant stress. My blood pressure, previously well controlled, spiked to concerning levels. I developed insomnia, lying awake listening to Thomas moving around the house at all hours. I lost 15 pounds without trying, my appetite diminished by anxiety. At my annual checkup, Dr. Mitchell noted the changes with concern. Eleanor, is everything okay at home? She asked gently. I nearly broke down then, the weight of my situation suddenly unbearable. But shame kept me silent. What would people think if they knew I couldn't manage my own son? That I was afraid in my own home? Just some stress, I said, accepting the prescription for anti-anxiety medication she offered. My social circle, once vibrant with church friends, former nursing colleagues, and neighborhood acquaintances, shrank dramatically. Thomas would answer the door when friends came by, telling them I was resting and couldn't be disturbed. He would delete voicemails before I could hear them, claiming they were just telemarketers. When I did manage to make plans, he would create last-minute emergencies requiring my presence. I can't believe you'd go to lunch with Mabel when I'm not feeling well, he would say, suddenly developing a migraine or stomach issue minutes before I was due to leave. Thomas's drinking worsened, his behavior becoming increasingly unpredictable. Some days he would be almost charming, reminiscing about childhood memories and thanking me for letting him stay. These moments would rekindle my hope that my real son was still in there somewhere. Other days he would rage through the house like a storm, finding fault with everything from the way I loaded the dishwasher to the sound of my breathing. The most painful changes involved my grandchildren. Their visits, once a source of joy, became tense affairs supervised closely by Thomas. He would criticize Emma's choice of clothes, Jason's posture, their table manners, and their schoolwork. I noticed how they grew quiet when their father entered the room, their natural childish exuberance extinguished. After one visit, I gently suggested that perhaps he was being too hard on them. You're undermining my authority, he snapped. Don't try to turn my kids against me like Stephanie did. No amount of explanation that I was simply concerned about their happiness would penetrate his defensive anger. The first incident of physical intimidation happened 15 months after Thomas moved in. I had received the water bill, which had doubled since his arrival due to his long showers and daily laundry. When I suggested he might help with the increased utility costs, he shot out of his chair, towering over me with clenched fists. After everything I gave up to be here and take care of you, you're nickel-and-diming me? He shouted, his face inches from mine. Maybe I should just leave you alone to rot in this house. I backed away, hands raised placatingly. I'm sorry, Thomas. Forget I mentioned it. He stormed out, returning hours later drunk and acting as though nothing had happened. But something fundamental had shifted. The unspoken threat of physical violence now hung in the air between us. That night, I locked my bedroom door for the first time. Lying in bed, I remembered how Thomas as a little boy would run to me with skinned knees, seeking comfort in my arms. How had that sweet child transformed into this angry, intimidating man? What had I done wrong as a mother? The questions circled in my mind like vultures, preventing sleep. The next morning, Thomas was oddly cheerful, making coffee and asking about my plans for the day. This pattern would become familiar over time. Explosion, withdrawal, then a period of relative calm before the cycle began again. It was as though he was testing boundaries, seeing how far he could push before I would break. In my lowest moments, I would drive to the cemetery where Richard was buried. Sitting by his headstone, I would talk to him as though he could hear me. I don't know what to do, Richard, I whispered one cold afternoon. He's our son, but I don't recognize him anymore. I'm afraid, and I'm ashamed of being afraid. I could almost hear Richard's voice in the wind. Ellie, you deserve better than this. But knowing what I deserved and finding the courage to demand it were two very different things. For now, I returned to the house that no longer felt like home, to face the son who no longer acted like my child. The financial abuse began subtly, like a slow leak that eventually floods the house. Thomas had already been borrowing money regularly, but around the 18-month mark of his stay, his approach changed. Mom, I've been thinking about your finances, he said one morning, uncharacteristically joining me for breakfast. At your age, you should have someone helping manage your accounts. For safety. I reminded him that I had managed our household finances since Richard died, and was perfectly capable of continuing to do so. But what if something happens to you? He pressed. What if you fall or have a stroke? Someone needs to have access to pay your bills. His concern seemed reasonable when framed that way. After some discussion, I agreed to add him as a joint account holder on my checking account. What harm could it do? He was my son after all. Within weeks, I noticed unusual transactions in the account. Withdrawals of $200 here, $300 there. When I questioned Thomas, he looked offended. I had some expenses. I was going to tell you. Why are you checking up on me like I'm a child? It's not about checking up, I tried to explain. It's just that I need to know when large amounts are being withdrawn, so I can adjust my budget. He muttered something about trust and stormed out. The withdrawals continued, but I stopped mentioning them to avoid conflict. My retirement account, once a comfortable nest egg that would have sustained me for years, was dwindling alarmingly. Between the increased household expenses, Thomas's loans, and his occasional large purchases justified as investments, my financial security was eroding rapidly. One evening, Thomas brought up the house itself. Mom, have you thought about what happens to this place when you need to go into a nursing home? He asked, his tone deceptively casual. I'm not planning on a nursing home, I replied. I'm still independent and intend to stay that way. But Medicaid will take the house if you need care, he continued. You should consider putting it in my name now for asset protection. My friend Brad is a financial advisor. He does this kind of planning all the time. The suggestion made me uneasy. The house was my largest asset, the product of decades of mortgage payments and careful maintenance. It was also my last tangible connection to the life Richard and I had built together. I'd need to think about that, I said carefully. Maybe talk to my own financial advisor. Thomas's expression darkened. Don't you trust me? I'm just trying to protect your assets from the government. Despite my reservations, I agreed to meet with his friend Brad. The meeting felt rushed and pressured, with complex terms and dire warnings about spend-down requirements and look-back periods. Brad presented papers for me to sign that would transfer the deed to Thomas while retaining me a life estate. This way you can live here until you die, but the house is protected, Brad explained, sliding a pen toward me. Something in his avoided eye contact triggered an alarm bell in my mind. I told them I needed to review the documents with my own attorney before signing. Why waste money on lawyer fees? Thomas argued on the drive home. Brad is giving us a friends and family discount. I held firm, saying I wouldn't sign anything without independent review. Thomas was coldly silent for days afterward. My moment of clarity came when I checked my credit report. I had read an article about identity theft targeting seniors and decided to be proactive. What I discovered left me breathless with shock. 3 new credit cards had been opened in my name within the past year, all carrying balances close to their limits. A personal loan for $15,000 I never applied for. All told, there was over $40,000 of debt in my name that I knew nothing about. Hands shaking, I confronted Thomas that evening. For once, I didn't soften my approach or choose my words carefully. How could you do this? I demanded, throwing the credit report on the table. This is fraud, Thomas. Criminal fraud. Instead of denial, his response was cold anger. What was I supposed to do? You nickel and dime me every time I need money, treating me like I'm taking advantage. I needed to get back on my feet, and this was temporary. I was going to pay it all back before you ever found out. With what money? I asked. You haven't worked in nearly 2 years. I have prospects, he insisted vaguely. Deals in the works. When I suggested we needed to close these fraudulent accounts immediately, his demeanor changed to one I had come to fear. If you make a fuss about this, I'll tell them you authorized me to open these accounts, he threatened. Who do you think they'll believe? An old woman who might be getting forgetful, or her responsible son who moved in to take care of her. The realization that my own son would threaten me with allegations of mental incompetence was like a physical blow. That night, after Thomas had passed out from drinking, I quietly called a law office I found online that specialized in elder law. I left a message requesting an urgent appointment, my voice barely above a whisper despite being alone in my room. The next morning, I drove to the public library to use their computer, afraid to search for legal help on my home computer in case Thomas monitored my browsing history. The librarian, seeing my distress, helped me find resources on elder abuse and financial exploitation. As I read through the material, phrases jumped out at me: isolation from friends and family, gradual taking over of finances, emotional manipulation, threats. Each one described my situation with Thomas perfectly. This wasn't just a difficult living arrangement or a son going through hard times. This was abuse, as real as if he had been hitting me daily. When I returned home, Thomas was waiting, his expression thunderous. "Where were you?" he demanded. "I've been calling your cell for hours." I noticed my phone on the counter where I had deliberately left it, its screen showing 7 missed calls. "I went to the library," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The library? Since when do you go to the library?" His suspicious tone made it clear he didn't believe me. "Let me see your phone." "Why do you need to see my phone, Thomas?" "To see who you've been talking to," he said, as though this was a perfectly reasonable request. When I refused, he grabbed my purse, dumping its contents onto the floor and snatching up my phone. I watched in horror as he scrolled through my recent calls, his face darkening when he saw the call to the law office. "What's this?" he demanded. "Why are you calling lawyers behind my back?" "I needed legal advice," I said, summoning my courage. "About the credit cards and loan you took out in my name." He threw the phone against the wall, shattering its screen. "After everything I've done for you," he seethed, "this is how you repay me? By trying to cause legal problems for your own son." The argument escalated, with Thomas listing all the ways I had supposedly failed him as a mother, from childhood slights to current ingratitude. When he began threatening to have me evaluated for dementia if I didn't get in line, I felt something inside me break. Not my spirit, but the chains of guilt and obligation that had kept me hostage in this situation. I realized then that I needed help beyond what friends or family could provide. This was not a problem I could pray away or solve with maternal love. I was in danger, financially and potentially physically, in my own home. But even as this clarity dawned, I underestimated just how dangerous my situation had become. The day that changed everything began like many others. It was a Tuesday in late March, unseasonably cold for Kentucky. I had woken early, as I often did now, to have a few quiet hours before Thomas emerged from his room. The house was peaceful in the dawn light, and I savored my coffee at the kitchen table, watching cardinals at the bird feeder outside the window. Around 11, Thomas stumbled into the kitchen, clearly hungover from the night before. He opened the refrigerator, staring at its contents with disinterest before slamming it shut. "There's nothing to eat in this house," he complained, though I had gone grocery shopping just 2 days before. "I can make you some eggs," I offered, already rising from my chair. It had become automatic to try to appease him during these moods. "I don't want eggs," he snapped. "I want real food." I suggested several other options, each met with the same dismissal. Finally, I offered to make his childhood favorite, chicken noodle soup from scratch. "Fine, whatever," he muttered, retreating to the living room where the television soon blared with a sports program. I set about preparing the soup, a task that had once brought me joy. As I chopped vegetables and simmered the broth, I thought about the appointment I had secretly scheduled with a lawyer for the following day. A neighbor had agreed to drive me, understanding that I needed to keep the meeting confidential. I felt a mixture of dread and hope as I considered the possibility of reclaiming my life. The soup was nearly ready when Thomas returned to the kitchen, now holding a beer despite the early hour. "Is it done yet?" he asked, peering into the pot with a scowl. "How long does it take to make soup?" "Just a few more minutes for the noodles to soften," I explained, stirring the pot gently. He grunted, then noticed some mail I had placed on the counter. Among the envelopes was one from my bank. Before I could react, he had opened it. "What's this?" he demanded, waving the statement at me. "You opened another account? And transferred money to it?" The account was one I had opened at a different bank, moving a small portion of my remaining savings where he couldn't access it. It was meant to be a safety net, a way to pay for legal help and possibly temporary housing if needed. I needed a separate account for some expenses, I said, trying to keep my voice calm while my heart raced. What expenses? More secret lawyer meetings. He moved closer, his voice rising. You're hiding money from me now? It's my money, Thomas, I said, a rare moment of direct confrontation. I earned it over 40 years of nursing, and I need to protect what's left. Protect it from who? From me. He crumpled the statement in his fist. Your own son? The person taking care of you. The absurdity of his claim that he was taking care of me, rather than draining me financially and emotionally, sparked something in me. Taking care of me? I repeated, my voice growing stronger. You've taken my money, my home, my peace of mind. That's not care, Thomas. That's exploitation. His face contorted with rage. After everything I've sacrificed to be here. You ungrateful old woman. In that moment, standing my ground felt more important than avoiding his anger. For too long, I had tiptoed around his moods, making myself small in my own home. I want you to leave, I said, the words tumbling out before I could second-guess them. This arrangement isn't working. I need you to find somewhere else to live. For a moment he looked stunned, as though he couldn't believe I would dare set a boundary. Then his expression transformed into something I had never seen before, something almost inhuman in its fury. Without warning, he grabbed the handle of the soup pot and swung it toward me. I raised my arms instinctively, but not quickly enough. The boiling liquid hit my chest, neck, and arms, the pain immediate and overwhelming. I screamed as the scalding soup soaked through my clothing to my skin. Through the haze of pain, I heard Thomas's voice, cold and distinct. Die somewhere else, you miserable bitch. The shock of those words cut through even the physical agony. My own son, wishing death upon me. As I collapsed to the kitchen floor, steam rising from my soaked clothes, Thomas stepped over me and walked out the front door. I don't know how long I lay there, whimpering in pain. Eventually, I managed to crawl to the sink, pulling myself up to run cool water over my burned arms. My clothes clung to my scalded skin, but I was afraid to remove them, fearing the skin would come off with them. Somehow, I reached the phone and called my neighbor Martha. Her husband Jim found me slumped against the kitchen cabinets when they arrived minutes later. The look of horror on their faces told me how bad it was. Oh my God, Eleanor, Martha gasped. Who did this to you? Thomas, I whispered, the admission bringing fresh pain that had nothing to do with my burns. My son. The next hours passed in a blur of ambulance sirens, emergency room lights, and the gentle but firm questions from doctors and later, police officers. Second-degree burns covered 20% of my body, primarily my chest, neck, and arms. The medical staff carefully removed my clothing, applied specialized burn treatments, and administered pain medication that made the world go mercifully fuzzy at the edges. A kind-faced police officer sat beside my hospital bed, patiently waiting for me to be able to answer her questions. Mrs. Spencer, can you tell me what happened today? She asked when the worst of the pain had subsided. I told her everything, my voice breaking as I described my own son throwing boiling soup on me, and walking away as I lay injured on the floor. I expected to feel shame as I revealed the months of emotional and financial abuse, but instead, I felt a strange relief in finally speaking the truth aloud. We'll need to take photos of your injuries and get a formal statement, the officer explained. Would you like to press charges against your son? The question hit me like a physical blow. Press charges? Against Thomas? Despite everything, the thought of my son facing criminal charges made my heart contract painfully. I need to think about it, I said finally. The officer nodded understanding. That's completely normal. Take your time. We can still document everything now, and you can decide about charges later. While I was still in the hospital, Thomas returned to the house and changed the locks. Martha discovered this when she went to retrieve some clothing and personal items for me. She returned to the hospital empty-handed, anger radiating from her usually gentle demeanor. He's claiming you had a simple accident and are confused about what happened, she reported. He told me you've been showing signs of dementia, and that he's protecting your assets while you get the help you need. The calculated nature of his response chilled me. He was already implementing the very threat he had made, painting me as mentally incompetent to discredit anything I might say against him. After 3 days in the hospital, I was discharged but couldn't return to my own home. Thomas had barricaded himself there, refusing to speak with police except through a lawyer he had suddenly managed to afford. My friend Patricia, a former nursing colleague, offered her guest room while I recovered. "Stay as long as you need," she insisted. "That house isn't safe for you now." In Patricia's spare bedroom, I would wake from nightmares, feeling the phantom sensation of burning liquid on my skin. Worse than the physical pain were the words that echoed in my mind. "Die somewhere else." My own child, the baby I had nursed and raised, had not only physically attacked me but had wished death upon me. The shame I felt was overwhelming. What kind of mother raises a son capable of such cruelty? What had I done wrong? These questions tormented me as my burns slowly healed, leaving scars that would forever mark my body. The police continued their investigation, gathering evidence including statements from neighbors who had witnessed Thomas's erratic behavior in recent months. Martha and Jim had heard his yelling through open windows. Another neighbor had seen him shoving me during an argument on the front porch weeks earlier. Despite the mounting evidence and the encouragement of both the police and Patricia, I remained hesitant about pressing formal charges. The maternal instinct to protect my child, even from the consequences of his own actions, ran deep. "Eleanor," Patricia said one evening as she helped change my bandages, "I understand he's your son, but what he did wasn't just wrong, it was criminal. If he had done this to anyone else, would you hesitate to see him face consequences?" Her words pierced the fog of guilt and confusion that had surrounded me. Thomas was an adult man in his 40s, not a child who needed my protection, and his actions had nearly killed me. As my body healed, something else began to strengthen within me. Resolve. Thomas had taken so much from me already: my savings, my sense of security, my home. But he had not yet taken my dignity or my courage, though both had been badly damaged. It was time to reclaim what was mine, starting with the house Richard and I had worked so hard to secure. What I didn't yet understand was how difficult and dangerous that fight would be. My lowest point came during my 3rd week in Patricia's guest room. My burns were healing, but the emotional wounds felt raw and gaping. That morning, I caught a glimpse of myself in the bathroom mirror, and hardly recognized the woman staring back. Thin, pale, with dark circles under her eyes and a perpetual expression of wariness, I looked every bit of my 67 years and then some. "Who are you?" I whispered to my reflection. What happened to the strong woman who raised a child alone, who cared for the sick, who built a life after losing her husband? There was no answer, only the hollow-eyed gaze of a woman who had lost herself somewhere along the way. Later that day, at a follow-up appointment with my doctor, the nurse handed me a pamphlet while taking my vitals. "Elder Abuse, Recognition and Resources," the title read. I started to hand it back, the word elder striking me as applicable to someone much older than myself, but the nurse gently refused. "Just take a look," she said kindly. "Sometimes it helps to put a name to what's happening." That evening, alone in the guest room, I read the pamphlet cover to cover. It described types of elder abuse: physical, emotional, financial, neglect. Examples of each felt like they had been taken directly from my life with Thomas. The pamphlet ended with a toll-free number for an elder abuse hotline. For 3 days I carried that number in my pocket, taking it out occasionally to look at it before tucking it away again. On the 4th day, while Patricia was at the grocery store, I finally gathered the courage to call. A woman with a gentle voice answered. "Elder Justice Hotline. How can I help you today?" Words failed me momentarily. What could I say? My son tried to kill me? I'm afraid to go home? I've lost everything? I began hesitantly. I think I'm a victim of elder abuse. Speaking those words aloud broke something inside me. Tears came, then sobs that shook my still tender burns. The woman on the line waited patiently, offering quiet reassurance until I could continue. Over the next hour, I shared my story. The financial exploitation, the emotional abuse, the isolation, and finally the violence. With each revelation, the weight on my chest lightened slightly. The woman listened without judgment, then connected me with local resources, including a specialized elder law attorney named Margaret Cohen who offered free initial consultations. 2 days later, I sat in Margaret's office, medical records and financial documents spread across her desk. Unlike Thomas's financial advisor friend, Margaret took time to explain everything clearly, never rushing or pressuring me. Mrs. Spencer, based on what you've told me in these documents, you have a strong case for both elder abuse and financial exploitation, she said, her kind eyes meeting mine. The unauthorized credit cards alone constitute identity theft. The assault is a separate criminal matter, but it strengthens our position in reclaiming your property. Can I really get my house back? I asked, hardly daring to hope. The good news, Margaret said with a small smile, is that despite what Thomas told you, he never actually filed the property transfer documents. The house is still legally yours. We can secure an emergency protective order that will require him to vacate the premises immediately. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of genuine hope. My home, the tangible reminder of my life with Richard, was still mine. The protective order was granted the following day. A police escort accompanied me to the house to retrieve essential belongings while Thomas was ordered to stay away. Walking into my home after weeks away was surreal. Evidence of Thomas's destructive presence was everywhere. Empty liquor bottles, cigarette burns on furniture, walls punched in anger. But the true devastation became clear as I moved through the rooms. Family heirlooms were missing, including Richard's watch collection and my grandmother's silver. My jewelry box had been emptied of everything valuable. Even the modest savings bonds I had kept in my desk drawer for the grandchildren's education were gone. In the master bedroom, now occupied by Thomas, I found credit card statements in my name showing purchases of electronics, designer clothing, and transfers to online gambling sites. The total financial damage, including the fraudulent credit cards, unauthorized loans, and stolen items, would later be calculated at over $90,000, nearly wiping out my life savings. This is extensive, the officer accompanying me said, documenting the evidence. You should know, Mrs. Spencer, that financial elder abuse of this magnitude is a felony in Kentucky. The realization that my son might face serious prison time hit me hard. Despite everything, the maternal instinct to protect him remained. But as I stood in the wreckage of my home, surrounded by evidence of his betrayal, I understood that true love sometimes means allowing consequences to occur. With the protective order in place and legal proceedings beginning, I joined a support group for survivors of family violence. The first meeting was terrifying. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, nearly driving away several times before finding the courage to enter the community center where the group met. Inside, I found 8 other women ranging in age from their 20s to their 80s. Some had suffered abuse from spouses, others from adult children or siblings. As each shared her story, I was struck by the common themes. The isolation, the gradual erosion of self-worth, the complicated love for the abuser that made leaving so difficult. When my turn came, I spoke haltingly at first, then with increasing strength as supportive nods encouraged me. For the first time, I admitted aloud how afraid I had been in my own home, how ashamed I felt for allowing the abuse to continue, how I still struggled with guilt for taking legal action against my own son. You didn't cause this, said Gloria, an 82-year-old whose grandson had systematically stolen her retirement funds. And you couldn't have prevented it. The only thing you could control was how you responded once you recognized what was happening. And you're doing that now. That takes incredible courage. Her words were a balm to my wounded spirit. Perhaps I wasn't the failure as a mother that I had believed myself to be. With support from the group, my attorney, and friends like Patricia and Martha, I developed a comprehensive legal strategy. We pursued both criminal charges for the assault and civil action for the financial exploitation. Margaret helped me work with credit bureaus to dispute the fraudulent accounts and begin repairing my credit. Police arrested Thomas 3 weeks after the protective order was issued. He had violated its terms by returning to the house while I was staying with Patricia, attempting to remove more items. A neighbor called the police, who found him loading my late husband's tools into his car. The district attorney charged him with assault, financial exploitation of an elder, identity theft, and violation of a protective order. When offered a plea deal that would reduce his potential sentence, Thomas refused, maintaining his claim that I was mentally incompetent and had authorized all financial transactions. The case would go to trial, meaning I would need to testify against my son in open court. The months leading up to the trial were some of the most difficult of my life. Thomas's attorney attempted to intimidate me with claims that the stress of testimony might be too much for someone in my condition. Anonymous calls came to Patricia's house, always when I was alone, warning that I would regret pursuing the case. Though I couldn't prove Thomas was behind these calls, their timing and content left little doubt. Despite the pressure, I continued to prepare with the prosecutor, reviewing financial records and recounting the history of abuse. Each time I told my story, it became slightly easier, the shame diminishing as I recognized I had been a victim, not a willing participant. The day of the trial arrived, cold and rainy. I wore a high-necked blouse that covered the worst of my burn scars, though nothing could hide those on my hands and lower arms. As I was sworn in, I looked directly at Thomas for the first time since the assault. His eyes, so like his father's in color but utterly different in expression, stared back coldly. For 2 hours I testified about the gradual takeover of my finances, the emotional manipulation, the isolation from friends, and finally the assault itself. Thomas's attorney attempted to paint me as confused, suggesting I had given Thomas permission to use my credit and had accidentally spilled the soup on myself. "Mrs. Spencer," he asked in a tone of exaggerated patience, "isn't it possible that in your confused state, you simply don't remember authorizing these accounts?" Drawing strength from months of healing and support, I looked him directly in the eye. "Sir, I have never been confused about whether I authorized someone to steal $90,000 from me or throw boiling soup on my body. My mind is quite clear on those points." A small ripple of reaction passed through the courtroom. From the corner of my eye, I saw one juror nod slightly. After 3 days of testimony from medical professionals, financial experts, neighbors, and friends, the jury deliberated for just 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all charges. Thomas was sentenced to 8 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution, though I held little hope of ever recovering the money he had squandered. As the bailiff led him away, Thomas looked back at me with an expression of pure hatred. "This isn't over," he mouthed silently. Despite his threat, when the courtroom doors closed behind him, I felt a profound sense of closure. Not happiness, certainly not triumph, but the quiet relief of having stood up for myself and reclaimed my dignity. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited with cameras and microphones. Initially, I had dreaded media attention, wanting to keep my family's tragedy private. But Margaret had helped me see that speaking openly might help others in similar situations. "Mrs. Spencer," one reporter called, "how do you feel about the verdict?" Taking a deep breath, I faced the cameras. There is no victory in a case like this. Only justice and the hope for healing. If my story helps even one person recognize and escape abuse, then some good will have come from this pain. As the cameras flashed, I stood straight-backed and clear-eyed. The woman in the courthouse that day was not the same one who had glimpsed her broken reflection in Patricia's bathroom mirror months earlier. I was finding my way back to myself one difficult step at a time. Returning to my house after the trial was both a victory and a challenge. Though legally mine again, the home felt tainted by memories of abuse. Walls Thomas had punched needed repair. Carpets stained with spilled liquor required replacement. Beyond the physical damage was the invisible residue of fear that clung to rooms where I had once felt safe. "You could sell it," Patricia suggested gently when she helped me move back in. "Start fresh somewhere new." The thought had occurred to me as well. But as I stood in the living room where Richard and I had spent countless evenings, where we had watched Thomas take his first steps, where decades of both joy and sorrow had unfolded, I knew this was where I belonged. "This house isn't just walls and a roof," I explained. "It's the life Richard and I built together. If I leave, Thomas wins. He takes one more thing from me." So instead of fleeing, I began the process of reclamation. First came the practical repairs. Fixing holes in walls, replacing broken fixtures, changing the locks. A local handyman named Gerald, whose wife had attended church with me for years, offered reduced rates when he learned my situation. "My mother went through something similar with my brother," he confided while repairing the kitchen where the assault had occurred. "Addiction changed him into someone none of us recognized. It wasn't your fault, Mrs. Spencer." His kindness was the first of many unexpected gifts. When word spread through my church community about what had happened, People I hadn't seen in months due to Thomas's isolation tactics began to appear at my door. They came with casseroles, offers of help, and most precious of all, their company. Mabel organized a cleaning day where 6 women from church helped me scrub away the lingering cigarette smell and grime Thomas had left behind. Martha and Jim replanted my neglected garden with bright spring flowers. The lawn service Thomas had canceled offered to resume their work at a reduced senior rate. "You have more friends than you realized," Mabel told me as we sat on the porch after a long day of cleaning. "We just couldn't get past your son to reach you." Financial recovery proved more challenging. Though the court had ordered restitution, Thomas had spent or gambled away most of what he'd stolen. The fraudulent credit accounts were eventually removed from my credit report, but not before damaging my once excellent credit score. My retirement savings were severely depleted. Margaret connected me with a financial counselor who specialized in helping seniors recover from financial exploitation. Together, we created a realistic budget that would allow me to keep my home and maintain a modest but dignified lifestyle. I would need to be careful with expenses, but I wouldn't lose everything Thomas had tried to take. The physical scars from the burns began to fade, though some would always remain, particularly on my chest and left arm. More difficult to heal were the emotional wounds. Nightmares plagued me, often featuring Thomas breaking into the house or hurting my grandchildren. During the day, unexpected sounds would trigger a fear response that left me trembling. Dr. Mitchell referred me to a therapist named Rachel who specialized in trauma recovery. In our sessions, I learned that my reactions were normal responses to abnormal circumstances. "What you're experiencing is post-traumatic stress," Rachel explained. "Your body and mind are still protecting you from a threat they perceive as ongoing. With time and work, these responses will diminish." Rachel introduced me to grounding techniques that helped when panic threatened to overwhelm me. She guided me through the complex emotions I felt toward Thomas. The anger, the grief, the guilt, and yes, the love that remained despite everything. We worked on separating my identity as a mother from Thomas's actions as an adult. "You did not cause his behavior," she reminded me often. "The choices he made were his alone." Slowly, painfully, I came to accept this truth. The child I had raised with love had made his own choices as an adult. While I could examine my parenting for lessons learned, I could not and should not carry the burden of his crimes. For months after the trial, I received a letter from the prison where Thomas was serving his sentence. My hand shook as I opened it, unsure what to expect. The single page contained no apology, only bitter accusations and renewed threats for when he was released. Rachel had prepared me for this possibility. "Abusers rarely take responsibility," she had warned. "His letter tells you about his state of mind, not about your worth." Though the words stung, they did not devastate me as they once would have. I filed the letter in a folder Margaret had suggested I keep for any future legal proceedings, then went outside to tend my reviving garden. Reconnecting with Emma and Jason, now teenagers, became a priority as I healed. Stephanie had kept them away during the worst of Thomas's behavior, protecting them as any good mother would. Now, with Thomas in prison, she cautiously allowed them back into my life. Our first meeting was awkward, the children clearly uncertain how to relate to the grandmother they had only seen sporadically for years. I decided honesty, tempered by age-appropriate explanations, was the best approach. "Your father made some very poor choices," I told them as we sat in my kitchen over cookies I had baked that morning. "He took things that weren't his and hurt me badly. He's facing the consequences of those choices now. But none of this changes how much I love you both." Emma, 14 and perceptive beyond her years, asked the question I had been dreading. "Did Dad really try to kill you, Grandma? Kids at school say he did." The temptation to shield them from the ugliest truths was strong, but these children had already been lied to enough. "He hurt me very badly," I said carefully. "Whether he intended to kill me, only he knows for sure. But what matters now is that we all heal and move forward." Over the following months, our relationship slowly rebuilt. I attended Jason's baseball games and Emma's school play. We established a Sunday dinner tradition that became a bright spot in my week. Through them, I glimpsed echoes of the sweet boy Thomas had once been, reminding me that goodness could emerge even from painful legacies. 6 months after the trial, I found unexpected purpose through my support group. Gloria suggested we create an educational program about elder abuse for local senior centers. So many people are suffering in silence, just like we did, she pointed out. They don't even know there's a name for what they're experiencing, let alone that help exists. Our first presentation was terrifying. Standing before 20 seniors at the local community center, I shared my story in all its painful detail. The scars on my arms were visible in my short-sleeved blouse, physical evidence of the price of my silence. When I finished speaking, the room was quiet for a long moment. Then an elderly man in the back raised his hand. "My daughter controls all my money," he said, his voice quavering. "She says it's to protect me, but I never see where it goes." Is that what happened to you?" "That's how it started," I confirmed gently. "Would you like to talk with someone who can help?" By the end of that first session, 3 attendees had requested private conversations with the elder law attorney we had invited. Our small presentation had potentially saved 3 people from the path I had walked. The success of that first event led to others. Soon, I was speaking regularly at senior centers, church groups, and even training sessions for medical professionals about recognizing the signs of elder abuse. Each time I shared my story, it became less about my personal trauma and more about the larger issue affecting thousands of seniors across the country. My newfound advocacy work connected me with others who had survived similar experiences. Together, we formed a network of support for new victims coming forward. When a local woman needed emergency housing after fleeing her abusive son, I offered my spare bedroom without hesitation. Her gratitude was overwhelming, but the healing I found in helping her was even greater. 1 year after the assault, I established the Second Chapter Foundation, a small nonprofit dedicated to helping seniors recover financially from exploitation. We provided emergency grants for housing, legal fees, and essential needs to those who had lost everything to abusive family members. Though modest in scope, the foundation gave practical help to those at their most vulnerable. On difficult days, when memories threatened to overwhelm me or when another letter arrived from prison, I would sit in Richard's old study, now my office for foundation work. "I wish you could see me now," I would tell his photograph. "I think you'd be proud." I imagined he would be. The woman I had become was stronger than the one he had known, tempered by fire both literal and figurative. I had discovered reserves of courage I never knew I possessed. The path forward wasn't always clear or easy. There were days when grief for the son I had lost to addiction and his own demons felt unbearable. There were moments when fear returned, sharp and overwhelming, at the thought of his eventual release from prison. But these hard days grew fewer as time passed and healing deepened. 2 years after the trial, I stood before a room full of social workers, law enforcement officers, and healthcare providers, training them to recognize the often subtle signs of elder abuse. As I concluded my presentation, a young police officer approached me. "Mrs. Spencer," he said, "my grandmother is in a situation similar to what you described. She's afraid to speak up because it's her daughter, my aunt, who's taking advantage of her. What should I tell her?" I took his hand between mine, the burn scars visible against his unblemished skin. "Tell her she deserves better," I said. "Tell her help is available. Tell her she is not alone." And neither was I. From the ashes of betrayal and violence, I had built a new life of purpose and connection. The scars would always remain, reminders of what I had survived. But they no longer defined me. What defined me now were the lives I touched, the seniors I helped protect, and the strength I had found within myself. I often think about what I would tell my younger self, the woman who welcomed her troubled son home with open arms and an open heart. I wouldn't warn her away from that choice, for the path of suffering led ultimately to wisdom and purpose I might never have found otherwise. Instead, I would tell her that her worth was never dependent on others' treatment of her, that boundaries are an expression of love rather than its denial, and that even in our darkest moments, healing remains possible. This is the message I carry forward not just for others but for myself. We are more than the worst things that happen to us. We are more than the worst things we have survived. And sometimes the deepest wounds become the openings through which our greatest gifts to the world emerge. Have you ever had to make the difficult choice between family loyalty and self-protection? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if my story resonated with you, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing to help others recognize they're not alone in their struggles. Thank you for listening to my journey. And remember that it's never too late to begin your second chapter. No matter your age, you deserve safety, respect, and love.